Welcome to Fresno CityVision. I'm Randy Reed. When you think about it, the character of a city is often influenced by the quality and style of the architecture that you find there. Some cities have a very historic feel, others more modern, but most are a blending of old and new. Cities evolve over time, of course, and so a city's character can also be affected by how a community approaches the process of updating to meet current needs and whether there is also an appreciation for the architectural history of that community. While you may not know it, Fresno has a fairly rich architectural history itself, so I've asked Karana Hattersley-Drayton, the City of Fresno's Historic Preservation Officer, to tell us more. Karana, welcome to Fresno CityVision.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Tell us a little bit about, just to start us off, about what folks need to know about Fresno's architectural heritage.
Well, I think that it's diverse, it's rich, and I think being a fairly newbie to this community, I've been here 10 years,
okay.
I think two things that have impressed me right off the bat were, one, the historic landscapes. And we'll talk, I think we have some images, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but, you know, colonies, agricultural colonies and all those beautiful landscape boulevards. And also that from the pretty early on, the buildings that were designed here were designed by leading architects or architects who were, even if they were local, were trained at Berkeley, MIT, Stanford, and then much later at USC. So this was never like a backwater place,
okay,
architecturally speaking.
Right, okay, and you're right. We're going to take a look at some images here in just a little while. Before we get to that, tell us a little bit about your background and your role as the Historic Preservation Officer for the City of Fresno. What does that mean? What's it all about?
I don't wear no stinking badge.
Okay, all right.
I have a training, a very Catholic training, which is useful. I went to Berkeley, UC Berkeley forever,
okay.
And my background is in anthropology, folklore, and architecture history, and those things, and history, okay. And those things really work well together. And I was hired initially by Caltrans to be an architecture historian. That's what brought me to Fresno.
All right.
And then 3 years later, the opportunity to be the historic preservation project manager for the city opened up. And that was exciting because it's much more proactive rather than here's a road and we're going here and what's in the way, that kind of thing. So,
okay.
Yeah.
So now how do you interact with, you're in the planning and development department, so how do you interact with projects that come forward? Some folks in our community are very protective about history. Others are thinking maybe, well, this is just kind of getting in the way of progress. So how do you balance those two competing interests?
Very difficult.
Okay.
It's very hard.
Yeah.
We have a historic preservation program that was set up in 1979 by the City Council when they adopted an ordinance, and that put together a local register of historic resources patterned after the National Register, and also established a Historic Preservation Commission. So I work with the commission. And then, but separate from that, we have federal and state laws that direct us to do environmental reviews. And so if there's going to be a project, you have to look at the impact to the environment, and the environment just doesn't mean critters or air or traffic, it's also historic and cultural resources, something under the ground. Are there Chinese tunnels there, whatever. So I do a lot of environmental review, and as a project comes into the planning and development, I have to look and see, whether there might be some issues that we need to address.
Okay, very good. Well, we're going to take a look at a couple of images that you brought with us, with you, to talk about the historical legacy, if you will, of architecture in Fresno. And the first image we're going to look at is on the screen, and that's a very early photo of downtown Fresno. What do you see there? Yeah.
Right. Well, Fresno was founded in 1872 as a railroad town, and so you're looking at the early grid, and you're not looking at the railroad, you're looking away from it. You're looking at Fresno Street. In 1882, so very early, the beginning of our community. This is a wonderful photo from the Historical Society. I have to thank them. But I think what's really important to note is that within 20 years or so, and I think if we go to the next image, we'll see this, Fresno developed a major downtown that rivaled any you could say we were in San Francisco there. It was high Victorian Gothic revival.
Is this 1890s?
This shot right now is about 1900.
Okay.
And you're looking at the county courthouse down the axis of Mariposa, and of course none of these buildings are there anymore. So this is a sort of an object lesson about what we've lost, but it's also an object lesson about what we've gained. So, because in your opening remarks, you made a really good point about good cities, great cities are a mix of old and new, and most of us probably don't want to live, in Williamsburg or live in a place that never changes. Right. So the question becomes, who's making the decisions about that change?
Okay. And while these particular buildings that we were just looking at, those are all gone, but other buildings were built in their place,
Yes.
some of which also are very historical
Yes,
and
yeah.
architecturally significant.
We have a classic revival downtown now that's really quite remarkable. And I think the next image shows one of the icons of Fresno. And I think it's important to note that this building was threatened with demolition.
The water tower was?
Oh, yes.
Is that a fact?
There are still people who think it shouldn't be there.
Wow.
1894, but I think this is a good example of a major building that's become, like I said, an icon for our city. It's the Axis Mundi. I had to get that term in.
What does that mean exactly?
Center of the world.
Okay.
Yeah, it really, I mean, this defines Fresno. I mean, it's not, that's not a building you're going to see in Sacramento or in Chicago anymore,
right.
or in the middle of Kansas. It's Fresno. It really defines.
And it was designed by a notable architect
Exactly,
as well,
and that
right?
was the other point I was going to make, that it was designed by George Mayer, and it was patterned after a Romanesque style building in Germany, but it was patterned after the old Chicago water tower that survived their big fire. And in fact, what was kind of interesting is that building, our water tower, for a while was meant to have a library underneath the water tank. I don't know if that's such a great idea
right.
or not. You know, water, books.
Yeah, maybe usually don't mix.
Yeah. But other architects that have worked here, I think we have another image coming up
Let's
soon.
take a look at the next picture then.
Which is the YWCA Residence Hall.
And where is this located?
This is right, golly, you would say.
It's in the downtown area.
Yes, it's just a little north of downtown.
Okay.
It's not on L, it's in MN, around in there.
Okay.
And it probably doesn't look like, it's not a classic revival building, but this is a residence hall for the YWCA that was designed by Julia Morgan, and that's a name that some people will recognize. Julia Morgan, of course, was trained at the Académie des Beaux-Arts in France, and was the first woman. In fact, the only reason that she was allowed to come in is she entered as applied as J. Morgan, and they thought it was John Morgan.
Really?
So
Okay.
she was quite a trendsetter, and she designed her Samsimian Castle, which most people will recognize. And she was just a major figure. She came to Fresno. She worked with the local folks here who wanted to promote the Ys, because this was at a time, 1920, when women were moving off the farm and off those little towns to go to the big city to work, and they needed safe places to live.
Right.
And so that was why that building was developed, and it's been very beautifully taken care of.
So